Since sunset, the rain had been falling, transforming the winding, narrow road into a slippery ribbon of black glass. It seemed as though I was driving into space as my headlights warped the lines as they reflected off the wet pavement. Squealing with every pass, the wipers worked frantically, but it seemed as if they did little more than smear the darkness rather than remove it. The neon vacancy sign of a roadside motel flickered in my rearview mirror after I had been driving for hours, my body hurting from the drive's rigidity. I ought to have stopped. I wish I had stopped, God. However, I shuddered at the thought of spending the night in that moldy, mildew-smelling room I had spent the previous night in. With the idea of finding something, anything, to keep my foot on the gas, I continued. I saw it then. Ahead, through the haze of fog and rain, an ancient wooden sign appeared on the side of the road, lit only by my headlight's dim beam. Years of neglect had warped and splintered the wood, and the paint had peeled so much that it was nearly unreadable. Squinting through the streaked glass, I slowed down and read the faded words. Hillcrest, 2 miles. I had no idea what the name meant, but it stuck in my head like a thorn. I couldn't quite put my finger on why, but I felt a strange pull in its direction, as if the sign had been waiting for me in the dark. Before my brain could object, my hands turned the wheel, and my car veered onto the side road that led into the trees. The transformation happened instantly. This path felt completely deserted, whereas the main highway had been lonely. The ragged edges of the asphalt crumbled into the ground as it grew narrower until it was just barely wide enough for my car. The sky was obscured by the skeletal branches of towering trees that towered over me. Rain continued to fall, but it was muffled to an odd, irregular patter beneath that canopy. Here the mist that had started to curl around the trunk seemed to swallow my high beams, making them seem weaker. The farther I drove, the stranger it felt, as if I were sinking into some secret corner of the world, rather than traveling through space. Then I became aware of the quiet. It started out subtly, with the rhythm of the rain waning and the engine's hum becoming less audible. But in a matter of seconds, nothing remained. Absolutely no sound. A cold pressure started to build at the base of my skull as I tightened my hold on the steering wheel. I reached for the radio in the hopes that the oppressive silence would be broken by the hiss of a station. Any station. Rather, the speakers were filled with harsh, sharp static that sounded like whispers entangled in white noise. When my headlights broke through a pocket of fog and showed me what was ahead, I nearly turned them off. A number. Drenched in the pale haze, it stood dead center in the road, motionless as stone. I initially believed it might be a lost hitchhiker, but something wasn't quite right. I wasn't being waved down by them. They weren't even moving. Even from this distance, I could sense their cold, piercing, and unblinking attention as their head tipped just enough, as though they were observing me. My heart started beating louder and louder in my ears. My car slowed to a crawl as I stepped lightly on the brake, but the figure remained motionless. Everything beneath their shoulders was obscured by the swirling, thicker fog. And that's when I understood. I was unable to see their face, not because it was too gloomy, but because there was only a shadow where a face should have been. I briefly considered turning the car around while my foot was hovering over the brake. Reversing felt like driving blind into a wall of white, though, because the road was too narrow and the fog had gotten so thick behind me. I gave the horn a single tap. As if the air itself had swallowed it whole, the sound seemed to disappear as soon as it left the car. The figure remained motionless. Not a step, not a twitch. It felt like a cold hand stroking the back of my neck, causing my skin to prickle. I pushed the car forward against all my remaining instincts. It felt more incorrect the closer I got, as though there was something thicker and heavier between us, as if the air itself were resisting me, rather than just distance. The figure's edges appeared to blur, their outline flickering like a malfunctioning image on an outdated screen, even though my headlights should have shown more. I could finally see their clothing at a distance of perhaps 20 feet, a long, wet coat that hung limp and dripped into the fog. Their fingers were stiff and pale, and their arms hung strangely straight at their sides. I started to yell, but as soon as I noticed movement, the words left my throat. From the shadows gathered at their feet, not from them. Dark tendrils crawled across the wet asphalt toward my tires as it slithered outward. My hands shaking on the steering wheel, I slammed the car into reverse. but the engine sputtered, a sick, choked sound, and died. The lights on the dashboard went black after flickering once or twice. I breathed quickly and shallowly. I gave the ignition another go. Nothing. I could hear the faint thud of my own heartbeat as the silence closed in around me. I hoped the figure was gone when I looked up. They weren't. They were nearer. No sound, no footsteps, just a step closer, as though the distance had vanished in an instant. It hurt how tight my chest got. I locked the doors mindlessly, my trembling fingers barely touching the button. At that moment, I noticed something glinting where their face ought to have been. Not the eyes, not the skin. There was only a slight damp glimmer, as if their face mirrored the road. I briefly believed I saw shapes moving within the swirling fog. Faces, dozens of them. Despite having their mouths wide open, they made no sound. I was unable to turn away. I was unable to breathe. The figure then slowly and deliberately lifted one hand and pointed at me. The temperature in the car dropped the instant that finger pointed at me. The windshield was misted from the inside as my breath came out in short, sharp bursts. Then I heard it, a low hum, almost like someone humming to themselves. However, it wasn't external. It was within. I looked at the rearview mirror, and my chest constricted. Even though the backseat was vacant, the sound continued to intensify and spiral into innumerable overlapping whispers. They were calling me, even though I couldn't understand the language they were using. I reached for the ignition with a shaking hand. Nothing happened when the key turned once. The engine roared to life and coughed twice. I felt a wave of relief, but it passed quickly. My headlights flickered, and the figure, whose face was still a swirling void but somehow smiling, was now pressed against the driver's side window. I slammed my foot on the accelerator and screamed. Before catching and sending me hurtling into the choking fog, the tires shrieked against the wet asphalt. I refused to look at the dark shapes moving in the trees, instead focusing on the road's fading white lines. However, there was something moving next to me, following the car. I made myself look, and almost took a detour. The figure was there, gliding inches from the window, its head tilting unnaturally with each bump in the pavement. The shadows beneath it seemed to stretch ahead of us, twisting and bending the road like it was being swallowed. My hands ached from gripping the wheel, the whispers in my head now deafening, pushing me toward panic. I could see a faint light ahead, an exit, an end to this nightmare. I pushed the pedal to the floor, but as I burst through the fog into that light, my heart dropped. It wasn't the highway, it wasn't safety. I was back where I'd started, the peeling wooden sign reading Hillcrest 2 miles looming in my headlights. My breath hitched, my hands went cold. In the reflection of the rearview mirror, the back seat was no longer empty. The figure sat there, motionless, its head almost brushing the roof. The whispers stopped, and in a voice that was not human, it spoke a single word: drive. The world outside the windows dissolved into endless darkness as I pressed the accelerator again, and realized there would never be a way out. Did you like today's story? Leave your supernatural story in the comments to serve as a topic for the next video. See you later.